Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. It's been quite a start to 2025. We've got a new, or rather returning president in the US threatening 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods sold into America, and are about to get a new prime minister in Canada with Justin Trudeau's impending resignation. The bureaucracy in Ottawa is essentially frozen with a prorogation announcement, and even the new Liberal Prime Minister, whoever that might be, is likely to have an abbreviated tenure, with opposition parties threatening a non-confidence vote as soon as Parliament returns, triggering a federal election. On top of that, we've had 3 provincial elections in 2024 and are scheduled to have 2 more provincial and 2 territorial elections in 2025. That is a lot of political and economic upheaval. All Canadians, but especially nonprofits, will have to adjust and adapt to the ever-shifting political landscape and impacts on our economy. In our last episode, we talked to experts about how to navigate the enormous changes. Now we want to hear from Canadian charities and nonprofits. We want to understand what they're experiencing on the ground and in the field, and drill down on their deepest concerns and their strategies on how to navigate this ever-shifting landscape to survive and thrive into the future. Joining us to explore these important issues is Kishone Roy, a Canadian author and advocate who is Executive Director of the Federation of Community Social Services of BC. Formerly, Kishone was CEO of BC Nonprofit Housing Association, Chair of the BC Rental Housing Coalition, and helped establish Housing Central, a partnership that has become a national centre of excellence in affordable housing education and development across Pacific Canada. Nationally, Kishone helped found NCASA Financial, the Canadian Chartered Institute of Housing, the Canadian Rental Housing Index, and spent a decade as a senior advisor to government leaders in Ottawa and BC. Welcome to the podcast, Kishone.
Thank you so much for having me and for that kind introduction.
Well, across Canada, we've seen unprecedented political change with numerous provincial elections, as well as political upheaval federally. There was a close election outcome in British Columbia just last year. What impact are you seeing on your member organizations in terms of this political uncertainty?
Well, in BC's legislature specifically, the uncertainty and the change and the upheaval, even though there isn't a change of government, it is substantial. It might be 70+% of the MLAs are first-time MLAs. So even though many charities and local social service agencies know exactly what they're doing and what their needs are in community, now their political representatives are new on the job and in a deep learning phase. So education is and first-time relationship building is really central to what a lot of people are thinking about right now.
Are there concerns about how political changes are impacting or may impact funding for services? Is there any way that organizations can work to mitigate the impact of potential decreased funding, especially with these tariffs potentially on the horizon, should it happen?
It'd be a very weird thing for Donald Trump to make a tariff threat in the U.S. and for us to cut off community-based social services, which are essential and in good times and bad. And even though there's all this economic uncertainty, there hasn't been good times for community-based social services over the past 3 decades in Canada. In fact, when you look at it, over every era and every type of government, the amount of funding directed to community-based frontline organizations, the things that prevent police and health interactions that are so expensive, that funding has decreased in comparison to what we spend in health and policing constantly, municipally, federally, provincially, every election for decades. We continue to spend money on things that do not prevent health, doctor, and police and justice interactions. So yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but what's certain in community-based organizations is that governments, regardless of their political stripe, approach to this over the past few decades has squeezed them and has never provided them with the adequate support that's needed.
Well, that's an alarming trend. I had heard that, but hadn't had it, I guess, most eloquently expressed, especially how long this has been a trend. As an umbrella organization, are you ramping up your government relations and advocacy work right now? Can you Can you tell us about that?
We are, and I would say to not in the way I would like to, in the way we have to. The way I would like to would be to deepen our connection in community with the public servants who help deliver public services. But the nature of politics and government over the past period of time has meant that much more government relations is necessary at the leadership levels, directly with ministers and their deputies, as well as with in coalition with the broader sector in major public campaigns. Honestly, that wouldn't be necessary if public servants were empowered locally to help people in need. But instead, locally, when there are people in need, you have protests about homeless shelters. You have police interactions when you need social workers. So we've had to react in a range of different ways as a sector and as a umbrella organization to strengthen our relationships externally, as well as with partners who work in the sector who have a shared vision, partners who can be there in good times and bad, and regardless of what the partisan stripe of the government of the day is, because even those stripes have changed. You know, in BC, for example, I was a Liberal staffer for a decade. I never thought I would see an election where there was no Liberals allowed on the ballot anywhere in the province. So even for people who have seen political change, we're seeing the whole deletion of parties, ideologies, and a bigger right-left split mirroring what's going on in the United States than I think Pacific Canadians are used to.
Well, that is concerning, absolutely. And I guess I'm curious about what you're seeing among your members. Are they becoming increasingly engaged in advocacy, and are they trying to do outreach independently to develop relationships with new government ministers in British Columbia locally, or municipal officials, or even are they developing or working on relationship building with or have been with the existing federal government?
Well, yes, I would say though it's really different, the reaction in urban and rural areas, and some of that reflects the political outcome. We don't have a proportional electoral system here, so when there's a tight election, traditionally almost all the rural area of the province ends up either in opposition or in government, and in this case they're in opposition. So but our members have to deliver their services in every neighborhood and every community everywhere in the province. And so now for many of our members in rural areas, you have first-time MLAs who are conservative, who are not in government, but also may not be familiar with their local community organizations or the funding programs that they rely on. In the urban areas, you've also seen a younger and a first-time class of MLAs elected in the New Democrat caucus. And so some of them have previous relationships, but they've also, even at the ministerial level, have to go through a very quick education into the sector. And so our members are trying to meet with them, explain some of these things at the community level. But what's missing is a lot of history and a lot of understanding of the core way that community-based social service agencies help on an ongoing basis. I think a lot of that's been lost. People don't understand the funding agreements. They don't. And to your listeners and viewers in Ontario, the BC dynamic is a little bit different in that in the 90s, a lot of these services were downloaded to municipalities, and so the municipal infrastructure picks up a lot of the advocacy and relationship building. In British Columbia, a lot of these services were downloaded to community-based nonprofits, faith groups, co-ops, and small businesses. So they are more than ever now relying on organizations like ours to try and take a narrative of something that's really different in every community across the province and deliver some salient key points to new government entities.
Well, it's interesting because in speaking in our last episode to government relations experts, they talk about election periods and post-election periods as being somewhat of an opportunity, not just a challenge, in the sense that, you've got people who potentially you can learn to align your mandate and the work that you do to the platform that they ran on in a much more effective way once you know that they're actually going to be forming government. But then as well, you may be actually being able to capture the attention in by certain government officials and bureaucrats that in previous iterations by perhaps a different government, a different political party led government previously in place where you were unsuccessful, like opportunities might actually open up with new people in those positions. Do you have any tips about that or strategies that you can share for other organizations or members of your umbrella organization who are interested in kind of starting out doing government relations and advocacy work?
Uh, Two for sure. Two real tips that I think are important. First is to read the words that government political leaders are giving to their bureaucratic leaders, and that speaks to your point about your previous guests who cited the need for looking for opportunities. And I'll give an example. Just last week, British Columbia's premier released mandate letters to ministers. In our interactions over the past few months with bureaucrats, they had said they were really waiting on these mandate letters for direction. In those letters, there's a new political reality in which they say that they, as a government, want to focus less of their spending on administration and government bureaucracy, and a theme of spending it more on frontline services that help people in community. Now, I've never heard a bureaucrat say to me, "Yeah, we should cut some of our bureaucracy and spend the money in community to help people." But I've heard a lot of political leaders say things like that. Having it in the mandate letter now offers community organizations the opportunity to speak the government's language and to create metrics that could then say, okay, well, how much have you been spending on internal admin versus external support and community, percentage-wise going back? How much would you like to spend going forward? I would point to related to that first point, an important piece of research nationally by an organization called Get Well Canada. They've looked at the historic spending of governments regardless of political stripe over the past few decades. That's where my point earlier came from about this historic spending inequity. And you can see it in the state of affairs of social housing, for example, which for many decades, we built a normal amount of social housing in every community. I was raised in it in Hamilton. And then in around 1990, we stopped. And for about 3 decades, we didn't build any housing that was really linked to the incomes of local residents. And so now you have a deficit. We have that similar deficit when it comes to community-based social services and the things that prevent these rising healthcare and policing costs, right? So we haven't been spending on it. And so you have to take the words of government and the results that they want to achieve and offer them a path forward. My second point is an example of that I've been really impressed with by an organization I used to work for, but I had nothing to do with this particular proposal. And it's called the Rental Protection Fund. In this instance, the reason I mention it is because the the design of this fund, which at its first blush was about $500 million to purchase rental housing and keep it in the community-based social service sector to guide against rising rents. This idea didn't come from a bureaucrat, and it didn't come from a politician, right? It came from networks, the network of Housing Central and the partners there. And they were able to, through evidence, point a better path forward, where for a lower price you could achieve higher objectives, where you could direct capital now instead of the long-term spending commitments that you're wary of. And I think it's going to become a national best practice and model that federal governments and other provincial governments look to. So, to turn that into advice to somebody looking at advocacy, you have to operate with a spirit of abundance regardless of the times you are in. And sometimes that abundance is suffering. You have an abundance of people who know that what the government is doing is wrong, who know what's in these political documents is wrong, and can chart a better way forward. And the politicians may not clue in very early, but as your evidence and your coalition and your communications increases over time, it almost becomes a fait accompli that somebody is going to try these solutions to these dire problems that are not just here in BC, but really across the continent and in many cases around the world.
That's fascinating. Now, of course, when we talk about political change, we have addressed what's happened domestically, but the US election will obviously have impacts on Canada as well, both economically and socially. Is this something your organization or your member organizations are concerned about?
Well, on the social side, I think our members, and actually, I think society at large has been concerned about, regardless of the result of that election. Last year, any of your members who did their audits with KPMG will know that they attach a couple extra sheets to them that just talk about trends in general. One of those trends that really stuck out to me was 100% of the CEOs they interviewed said that social issues, when they looked at environmental, social, and governance, social issues were the ones that they would be most vexed and challenged with in the years ahead. And that was prior to this election result. But now is going to be exacerbated even more. And in fact, I think the response that we're seeing from the Trump administration and from other conservative political leaders around the world, when you translate what they're saying, they are speaking about social issues. They are genuinely concerned about homelessness, maybe for a range of different reasons. Maybe their solutions aren't based in any evidence or anything that's going to solve anything, but they're trying to root their economic and political messages around social issues. And so that's going to mean a lot of pain for a lot of people who have been marginalized and are just first experiencing support from government through some of the new changes that have been introduced over the past decade. For example, in 2015, so 10 years ago, there was no national housing strategy. Stephen Harper was still prime minister, and in many communities across the whole country, particularly Indigenous communities, but whole cities in some cases, large cities, they hadn't built any affordable housing in decades. And if you can think of an apartment, it takes about a decade to go from planning, financing, zoning, construction, to actually build it. So even if 10 years ago here in Vancouver, there was no NDP government then either. So even if Christy Clark as premier and Justin Trudeau, his first day as prime minister, had planted ground on an apartment, it likely still wouldn't be constructed yet. So the reason I say this is that even though we have our first national housing strategy and we have our first real provincial housing strategy, on the ground, the support that's really needed in community hasn't come yet. It hasn't been built yet, you know. And these organizations who are doing their first buildings are now gearing up to do their second and third because they know that those will be filled right away. So these social causes, I think, will dominate the needs of citizens in the decade ahead. And as it applies to the U.S. election, I guess I think of it as a person, as a queer person in particular. Like, I use they, them pronouns. I remember a time as a political staffer where gay marriage was illegal. I remember when Barack Obama ran against Hillary Clinton, and he was against gay marriage. And Stephen Harper, who was a conservative who had run against gay marriage, was the prime minister here in Canada who it was implemented under. And now these trans rights are facing a real attack, an attack that's going to be, it's going to lose people's lives. And I was always surprised that I got this right to legally use they, them pronouns. And now I realize these rights can be taken away from me very quickly. But I always realized it. I never took it too seriously because I know that gender minorities and visible minorities and mixed race people like me have been in the closets and behind the scenes and shunted aside and have had to suffer for a century and perhaps much longer in many cases. So I think what I'm not prepared for when it comes to the U.S. election, or what I didn't expect, was these ideas about bringing Canada into the United States. And if there's a heartening thing that I have in myself right now, is it's been a very, very long time since I've seen so many people coast to coast to coast be proud to be Canadian and looking for opportunities to talk about it. So I think he's going to unite this country in a way like maybe we haven't seen in my lifetime. And as somebody whose family have Acadian roots in New Brunswick and who was born in Hamilton, who has family in Quebec and has lived a life here in Pacific Canada, all of those parts of me feel very connected to Canadians across the country because of the threat of what he's posing. And I don't know how seriously we're supposed to take it, but it's insulting. And we weren't worthy of those insults.
I couldn't agree with you more, Kishone. And, in terms of the expectation or the lack of an expectation that, having basic rights taken away from one. I mean, I'm certain that women that live in the United States, obviously, they were shocked to discover that they didn't have control over their reproductive rights either. So, I mean, it's a frightening time when we can see, as you're speaking about, in terms of, gender issues, but also many other social issues and, issues about human rights being, frankly, potentially on the table is a frightening thing. And I too am gladdened by the response of Canadians who are just not prepared or significantly stating in a very energetic and muscular way that they aren't prepared to go down that path. So I certainly share your concern, and I appreciate you sharing that. Speaking again on the impact of the American election on Canada, of course, we touched on at the beginning of this discussion the imposition of tariffs on Canadian goods going into the United States. We've heard from experts and economists across the board saying it would be devastating to our economy, and we know that what's devastating for our economy is, increases enormously the demand on our nonprofits and charities, particularly in the social and community services sector, and generally in terms of reducing the capacity for Canadians to be able to donate when they have to tighten their purse strings too to get through what may end up being a recessionary kind of period that we go through. I'm curious, is this potential for a significant economic downturn in Canada, given the potential that seems increasingly realistic to expect? Can you talk about how that may impact social and community service organizations and their work? Are the organizations actively preparing now for this possibility?
Yes. I'll start with your second question too. Yes, I know our members are actively preparing for it, and the more sophisticated organizations are responding by doing everything they can to diversify their revenue streams, which does mean some capacity building internally and some questions and strategic planning about, where you would like to take funds and revenues. But it also, for the first time in many cases, means saying no to some projects because governments in their responses are inclined to offer contracts to local agencies that are underfunded from the beginning and won't be successful. And so how many of those can an organization take on before it realizes that it's subsidizing essential services? To your first point, I think there are some things in life that are more important than economics. And we have a little bit of a fault as a people of being money chasing and thinking that all of our emotions have to be linked to our economic prosperity of the day. All of this money, if you had all of it and you ask anyone, they would start at some point talking about actually helping people in community. And I've seen progressive local governments run billion-dollar surpluses and have thousands of people sleeping outside on the street. So these tough times have a way of crystallizing what's important to people and what they'd like to see in their neighborhood, in their community, in their country. And if there has been good economic times, if we are facing a downturn, that might be laughable to somebody who's been sleeping outside for 10, 15 years, or somebody who has a particular disability that has been on bare sustenance funding or no funding for an extended period of time. All of a sudden, I guess to be kind, I want to say that I think coming out of COVID, we're also coming out of a mass depression. And I mean that literally, not economically. There's a sadness inside many people. I particularly see it in young people whose school experience was thwarted and key social years were missed. It's probably in ways we don't see it impacting kids in their early years who would have relied on community connection supports, ideas, health services, and didn't have them during that time. But I also see it playing out in every family everywhere. And the anger and the hope that a lot of politicians are presenting right now are their way of dealing with that sadness they feel from the isolation, the death, and the disease that afflicted us all for a long time. And so people aren't feeling like they aren't feeling quite yet that in many ways what we need is a back to basics approach to things like wider sidewalks and homes for the homeless and food for the needy, and the things that as a people you would do until a war ended, and as peace started, it would be the first things you would start to do. These kind of supports for youth, seniors, people with disabilities, that if you had all the resources in the world you didn't do, now you have none of the resources, you still have to do it. You don't have a choice because we are all interconnected as a people to each other in every neighborhood, everywhere in the land. And, some would say that selfless service to each other was created at the same moment that humanity was created. So we're never going to stop doing this work. But economic conditions and Donald Trump and all of these flashy things combined with a real depression amongst humanity is going to force a reckoning about what's important.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective to look at, and at some point we have to turn off the noise. I mean, the news cycle is at breakneck speed. It's hardly even possible to absorb everything that's happening as quickly as it is, and one just really has to look, as you say, at the basics of what does it mean to have a healthy society and a meaningful community and supports for everyone in what we believe is a democratic, fair, equitable society. So I I do think you're right. We could be at that stage where we have to get back to the fundamentals in coming to terms with what needs to be done. Um, I'd like to shift gears for a minute and talk about Canada's changing demographics. I know you know this well. We we know that food banks, for example, are reporting more first-time users than ever before, more students, more newcomers to the country needing their services. This is a reflection of what you're talking about, I believe. Is this something that is reflected in what your member organizations are seeing in terms of the services they provide? Are shifting population demographics and population growth impacting the demand for service that we're seeing, or is this a blip?
Uh, I would say yes, and the and I would add is climate change. And so we'll start with food banks as an example. 30 years ago, I was a kid who was in lineup for food banks. Um, a community organization called Share Family Services in the Tri-Cities ran a local Christmas hamper, and we were a food bank using family. And for a lot of time, after my career in politics, I got back involved in the board of Share and started to work with social service agencies here in community back in BC. And there are many people who talk about food banks as something they want to eradicate, something that is a mission with an end to it. But climate change and the pandemic have really made me rethink this. I think maybe food banks are an essential community service, not just for changing demographic needs, but for emergency preparedness, both for climate change, political change, trade wars. If I was in Hollywood after a fire, it didn't really matter what my income was beforehand. If the grocery store had been burnt down, a food bank and a network of food banks in neighboring communities and locally can help think ahead long term about climate risks, demographic trends, to build something that is resilient at the local level. And whether it is a snowstorm that cuts off a community or ignorance by political leaders and the funding they need for essential services. I think at the local level, food banks are something that we should start to think bigger about, start to think of as I don't really want the political changes and climate change and social unrest to be permanent. But I wouldn't be unhappy if food banks were permanent. If I knew that when times were good, maybe the stores were a little lower because there were less people using it, but that at the base level, as part of emergency preparedness, the regional district and the city and the First Nations and the provincial and federal governments knew that every community had a safe store of food in case of all of this turmoil going on. So demographics are just one of many changes. Demographic change isn't something that Pacific Canadians have pushed against too much historically. In fact, I remember some really tough economic times, particularly in the north and in the west side of the island here, where it was $20,000 to buy a house because nobody was moving to these communities and major industries had shut down. And we want growth of our demographics and change in our demographics. In particular, we want young people to be able to stay in the neighborhoods and the communities they were raised in. And traditionally, we've kind of encouraged them to go off in other directions. Um, so some stability through things like food banks, social service agencies, maybe a good response to the uncertainty of the times ahead.
Um, I guess this is in relation to some future discussions we intend to have on this podcast season. This is in relation to population growth. In fact, very fast population growth that we've seen in Canada in recent years. We know that some smaller centers have seen surges in population growth. It's not just happening in the urban centers. They've seen it in small organizations, smaller centers, smaller towns as well. Has this been difficult for organizations in those areas to keep pace with? And does it create a unique challenge for nonprofits serving in those smaller and more rural centers where they may not have the infrastructure or the partnerships with other organizations in larger urban centers?
It it presents different opportunities and challenges in smaller rural communities. The biggest challenge is community connection. When a whole bunch of people move into a new community, it doesn't matter if you've been running the food bank for 30 or 40 years, or you've been delivering child development services or early years services for 60 or 70 years. If nobody knows your name and brand in the way that 20, 30 years ago was common parlance for who does this locally, it's where you donate when the holidays come along. So a lot of a real connection with first time people in a community is hard to do for nonprofits because they're generally looking at those demographics as people who need service and support. And so they wait for people in need, but not as people who are coming in as students and doctors and nurses and, people who need to know about your organization locally because they might want to donate, they might want to volunteer. You know, People need to be able to, as humans, they need to be able to do good in their community, to live happy and healthy lives. And if they don't know how to do that locally, they might get tied into a bunch of online federal schemes and hopes and dreams, and instead of understanding that locally there are organizations they can work with that can improve the grounds and neighborhoods they see for the rest of their lives. So that is a real challenge. On the other hand, though, um, and this is maybe just speaking from, I've spent a lot of the past year and a half traveling around uh, BC, speaking to uh, nonprofits and community organizations, social service organizations, and I've been surprised how many times it's been somebody from an exurb or a small town who's been able to tell a whole room full of people in a larger urban center how to do their job, how to find expertise. I actually think we may have something to learn from these organizations because they step up with the responsibility in a greater way. They're largely multi-service organizations already, so they don't have to diversify their revenue streams because they haven't been so sole focused, and they value local community connection and in a different way as well. Everybody values it highly, but they value it as part of every interaction with every person is somebody who's part of this community and might be for their whole lives, and we should get to know them, versus what services do you need by what time on what day at how much, and are we paying for it or are you as the government, which is a bit more of a what happens in the urban centers. So I think we have a lot to learn from these rural areas and smaller communities, and I think too, they um, they will need some support and respect and appreciation for what they're doing to be able to juggle the growth.
Well, I'd like to know whether population growth and demographic change, we've actually talked about this a little bit earlier, um, whether it provides opportunities as well as challenges for nonprofits. You alluded to the idea of, newcomers or um, uh, people who are part of the groups that are enhancing or increasing our population are our nonprofits don't even know how to speak to them necessarily and how to engage them as potential donors or volunteers or they tend to our society tends to think of people, as you say, who are in need, but we're not seeing the opportunities that we have in terms of developing a larger potential donor pool and being able to better recruit staff and volunteers. I'd like you to sort of go a little deeper on that topic and let me know what your thoughts are.
I was very inspired by an interview I listened to with a mayor in New Brunswick, in a small town, who was dealing with these demographic changes with excitement. We're going to need housing, we're going to need roads, we're going to need changes to our governance. We're going to have to move up from being a town to a city. I've known so much sadness in so many small towns that have seen entire industries abandon them, that have seen public support for ongoing infrastructure abandon them, and not as much excitement about the opportunity to grow again. Population growth, when it's portrayed as a negative, I understand it may come too fast, but it's too much of a good thing. It is a good thing. Population decline is the bad thing. You may not want the rate of people coming to your town that you may not be able to build to keep up with it. Our immigration levels may have gotten a little too high. But at the end of the day, people are good, and more people in your community is better. And people building your community up for the future, contributing to your food bank, building social housing, starting up a business, these are goods for your community. And maybe what's afflicting Americans right now is this idea that somehow Mexicans are bad, and Canadians are bad, and people are bad, and growth is bad. Well, what they're going to soon find out is the opposite of growth, which is decline, which is sadder, which is destructive, and which none of your economic models for all the capitalists out there work if you're just declining and declining and declining. Canada is going to grow for as long as I'm going to be alive, and it's going to grow faster than I think it's possible. If I have one big sadness and big hope for Canada right now, is at 48 years old, I'm just old enough to remember a Canada without mass homelessness. I'm just old enough to remember working in an MLA's office, and when somebody came in with housing insecurity, needing rent supplement, needing shelter, needing a place to stay, you worked the case as a staffer, and if you couldn't get help, your MLA would take it to the legislature and you'd help that person. But no longer are our local MPPs and MLAs and MPs and even cabinet ministers able to help a person find the essentials of life in their local community. That means that our democracy has suffered. We have become less powerful as people because our elected officials are less powerful. And so knowing that, it's hard for me to look at growth as a bad thing. I honestly want, I'm in Vancouver. I want this to be a growing community. There's a lot of people locally here who thought we were finished and closed. We were never going to develop anything again. This is good enough. And they wanted to retire and see their way off in the sunset. We need young people here. We need people from around the world here because we're a very important world center, up and coming, thriving World Center that has a lot to say, where we hosted Olympics, where the TED conferences happen, where to speak to climate again, where Greenpeace was founded, something that's helped people all over the world. David Suzuki Foundation, started here, something that's influenced people across Canada their whole lives. So all this growth, I think, is good as long as humans are good. And if humans aren't being good, it's a responsibility of those who know what goodness looks like to take them under their wings and help them find value and meaning in their life.
Well, on that point, I'd like you to sort of turn your attention to the years ahead. Looking ahead a few years, what do you think the key issues that your organization is working on will be when it comes to advocacy? And what do you see as the key challenges facing the sector, the nonprofit and charitable sector in British Columbia?
Um, well, first I'll speak to your listeners across the country, because people in Pacific Canada might know this about themselves when it comes to key issues. Because I think there are three great waves where Pacific Canada is leading the rest of the continent and certainly the country. And they've started a long time ago. And the first big wave is environmentalism and climate change. Long before we were talking about carbon taxes, environmentalism has been embedded in Pacific Canadian culture, ideas, politics, and ethics. And second, and now that we face major climate catastrophe, it's also more important, but it's also an area where we bring a lot of thought leadership. And as people are thinking of abandoning climate action and abandoning carbon taxes and abandoning the Paris Accords, I would say we in Pacific Canada need to understand that as the leaders of many of these actions, it's important for us to remain steadfast, because we have the scientific data to prove what we're doing, the economic data. We've had a carbon tax for a very long time here. Everybody's talking about it like it's a big boogeyman out there, but as far as I can tell, we have the best economic outcomes in the continent, and we have the highest carbon taxes, and we've done this for a very long time under many different government stripes. The second big wave of leadership coming out of Pacific Canada, I think, is on affordable housing. And we saw before there was a national housing strategy, and before there was even an NDP government, but certainly during their entire term since, which is now 7 years, major investments in social housing in a way that's evidence-based, that's in almost every neighborhood, that's a challenge, but that is going to stop us getting out of a pattern of just providing rent supplements and building shelters, where we're actually building long-term, sustainable, affordable housing in every community that's there for generations. And so we can't stop that. And the risk is that governments all across the continent will come into local authority and say, well, let's stop building this stuff and let's give it to the private sector to do some rent supplements. They do a lot of this in England, and it's because they don't have the stock, the basics. We have to understand that on housing across the whole country, we have a deficit, about 30 years deficit in our stock. And that deficit is deeper in Ontario than anywhere else. And the economic opportunity of the whole country will suffer if Ontario isn't able to lead us through change on housing in the future. But for the past decade, that leadership has come out of Pacific Canada. And the third great wave of change that I think that we're really leading here is on reconciliation. And this will tie into your second point about the key challenges, because the work we're doing around decolonization and reconciliation here is addressing fundamental systemic inequity, but is also opening the door to the first signs of Indigenous wealth and prosperity. Rights and entitlements that should have been there can be fulfilled through these, but it's also coming with a great obligation for Indigenous leaders. The biggest decolonization action, I think, in the whole country is happening here in Pacific Canada right now, and that's the decolonization of child welfare and protection systems from the provincial government to it could be over 200 different Indigenous authorities. The biggest challenge facing the sector in BC right now is uh, child welfare and protection, and the link between uh, young people and all the other social services, youth and housing, youth and mental health supports, youth and early learning supports, youth transitioning out of government care. If you look at any society, you could probably learn a lot about them, about how they treat people in their earliest years. And those societies probably benefit a lot later by citizens who had the benefit of that service in their early years. But we have to look at whole of life solutions for people with disabilities, and we have to look at things like mental health as not optional, but things that should have been included in our basic social safety net all along. I'm pretty certain our social safety net is deteriorating, and I don't want to be somebody who says we should just keep stitching together programs to patch up to help people along the way. I think we need to look around the world at what a modern social safety net looks like. And at some point, we'll realize that these areas like mental health supports and long-term disability supports and children's services are the kinds of things that every community anywhere in the world should want in a sustainable and sort of a best practice kind of world-class way. Because you don't know when you are going to interact with a social service agency or when one of your family members will need it. Maybe there was a climate emergency and maybe there was a fire and you all of a sudden needed a volunteer agency that came together to help you. Maybe somebody in your family has a drug addiction. Maybe there's somebody in your family ended up homeless. You just don't know. But what you should know is that the kind of community you're trying to build is one that has these on offer, and that this is the reason why economics is so important to people, is because we want to make sure that we have enough money to provide those essentials. But if we don't know what those essentials are and how much they're going to cost, and we can't relate to them in community, then as advocates, I think it's really important that we point that out to people. And I tell you, nobody was really pointing it out in housing 12 years ago. I would go into a CBC or CTV or Vancouver Sun studios to do an editorial board or a meeting with the on air. And I would talk about rental housing in 2013, 2014, and it was treated very paternalistically, very condescending. Oh, that's so nice you're talking about rental. You know, people only talk about home ownership. That's so cute that you're talking about homelessness. You know, that's not such a small piece of the demographic. And then when I would leave the interview, the young journalists and the camera operators and the interns would rush up to me to start telling me about their experiences in rental housing, which was a completely different one than colleagues who owned homes largely and who had incomes in the six figures. And so there was a real reality difference even inside the newsrooms that they weren't tuned to. And I just saw it with real people in front of me telling me different stories. You go into the big newsroom and they ask you how much housing prices up. You go into the talk to the new journalist and she's telling you about her own eviction.
Perfect. Well, that's a story that we see across Canada now, and certainly in Toronto is facing that as well. I mean, in a time when a young person who has all the advantages can't possibly imagine ever owning a house, you can't even comprehend what it must be like for somebody who might be more on the margins and is just who will struggle to find housing at all, and those in between who have and will spend their life in rental accommodations, which of course is a huge number of people across this country as well. So I think you must have been prescient at that time when you did those interviews. Kishone, it's been such a fascinating pleasure speaking with you and exploring your insights on the present and future challenges facing the Canadian nonprofit sector, and really getting a much clearer picture of the issues arising in British Columbia for nonprofits and charities, which gives us a window really in terms of what's happening nationally. It's really valuable in providing actionable advice, but also I think quite inspiring observations for our audience of nonprofit professionals to hear. And I want to thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to all the charities, nonprofits, co-ops, and others who are listening out there for doing the work that you do, for caring for it, and for participating in the programs and services of Charity Village, which I know have helped me and countless numbers of our members over the years.